For me, a formal book proposal has been a key component on my journey to having 10 books in print with 5 different publishers. I'm presently working on the proposal for book number 11. Writing was something I had always wanted to do, and I was never short of ideas. However, the handful of times I submitted a manuscript or tried to make unsolicited contact with a potential publisher didn't bear fruit and didn't bring any encouragement to take things further. At that time, I'd never even heard of writing a book proposal, let alone how it should be written and what it should contain. All I had were ideas that excited me. Now, there are guaranteed ways to get your manuscript into print through one of the pathways to self-publishing, but we're not looking at them today. However, they are worth mentioning in passing. Historically speaking, self-publishing is where an author pays for their work to be produced and then takes the personal receipt of the full print run. With the advent of print on demand and ebooks, it's now possible to produce your own book without any financial outlay with organizations like Omniscriptum from Latvia and the ebook platforms like Amazon's KPD, which is short for Kindle Publishing Direct. However, self-publishing is always academically suspect as it removes peer review from the publication process. It can also lead to a greatly inferior end product as the professional services provided by a reputable publishing house, from editing to production and marketing, are also absent. So my best advice is to resist the temptation to pursue one of these avenues that appear to provide you with a shortcut to publication. It's likely that you would live to regret it anyway. If you have previously self-published a manuscript, it is much less likely in the future that a mainstream publisher will be interested in picking it up because of its prior history in print. So, back to the book proposal itself. Having been unsuccessful in my early attempts to kickstart a writing project, my way into being a published author came entirely by chance. Having given a seminar on narrative preaching, I was approached afterwards by a freelance commissioning editor, been excited by what he had heard. He asked me if I was interested in writing a book on the subject. The answer, of course, was yes. It was he who introduced me to the idea of a book proposal. He gave me a template to work with and coached me in putting it together. And the truth is, it's not rocket science. It's actually quite straightforward and totally makes sense. It's just that if you don't know, you don't know, and you don't know that you don't know. Well, what I learned from him in the process was that it was not enough by a long way merely to have a great subject to write about, the academic credentials and ministry experience to write with credibility, and an engaging writing style to put it onto paper. No, the key thing to have in mind is that commercial publishing is just that. It is commercial publishing. It's a commercial enterprise. Their intention is to make a profit on what they publish. At the very least, they don't want to lose money. As a theological writer, therefore, I have to know who I'm writing for. Who is my audience? And will they want to spend their money to buy what I'm writing? This is so very different to doing academic research, where the objective is the more pure intellectual pursuit of knowledge, and our audience is the examiners of our dissertations, the peer reviewers of our journal articles, or our fellow theologians attending our lectures and seminars. My freelance commissioning editor also explained why he wanted a proposal. It was simple and obvious. First, those working at the publishing house did not have the time to read a full manuscript of every potential title. What they needed was a brief document that let them understand what the book was about, what it looked like in overview and in summary form, who the author was, who the audience was, and what its USP or unique selling point was. alongside what other competition was presently in the marketplace of theology books. Book proposal then becomes the key document prior to its acceptance, the book being commissioned, and the contract signed. It is the document that the publisher will send out for peer review. They probably don't have an expert in your field on staff, so if your idea is of potential interest to them, they will need to seek advice from people who are. My publishers seem to default to sending out a proposal to 2 independent peer reviewers. It's quite possible that feedback will mean adjusting the shape or trajectory of the proposal. This, of course, is another good reason for not having already completed your manuscript. And the decision to offer a contract rarely sits with a single editor. And the decision on my first book went to the publisher's acquisitions committee. And you can appreciate too why they also worked from book proposal documents rather than wanting or requiring full manuscripts. You can perhaps also begin to appreciate what is such an important document and why it's worth investing time and thought in getting it right. So what we're going to do this afternoon is to go through the template that we provided for a book proposal and explore its various component parts, thinking about what might be best practice and what should be borne in mind as you work on it. However, before we do that, there are a few other things to be aware of. First, we need a dose of realism. It is very difficult to get a book on academic theology published. There are various reasons for this. There are a limited number of publishers, and they each produce a limited number of books for what is, in publishing terms, a very small and niche marketplace. My present publisher, for example, the SCM Press, is one of the leading UK publishers of academic theology. And this year they will launch 40 new titles. But they're not short of submissions, so there is great competition to begin with. But they're also inclined to work with established authors who have a track record. I say this not to discourage you, but rather to prepare you for what may be a long haul. There are good reasons why this may be so. And of course, patience, perseverance, and endurance are good kingdom values. Then, second, when you've decided which publisher you wish to approach, visit their website. Most will have a submissions page that will tell you what their process is, what kind of titles they're looking for, and what they require from any submission that is made to them. Third, it's important to remember that it's very rare that research dissertations and theses are published without significant revision. This goes to the who is the audience question we covered earlier. Writing an academic treatise for examination and a qualification is a different task from communicating academic theological insight to a broader readership. You're writing to be read, not writing to be examined. And finally, everything I say this afternoon is based on my experience of English language publication in the UK, though the academic and practical principles involved will be translatable into other language marketplaces. However, I would add that if you're writing for English language publication and English is not your first language, it is worth getting a native speaker to proofread anything you write before submitting it. Having supervised research for postgraduate students from around the world, this was frequently an issue that we had to address. So, to the book proposal and the kind of things that you need to bear in mind. The template that I use, which we've circulated, has its origins in the freelance editor's advice that I previously mentioned. This is just one example. It's not an industry standard, and it's definitely not under copyright. It's probably worth underlining as well that the observations and suggestions that I make should not be taken as law or slavishly followed. They may help to guide you, but they're not immutable laws to be followed or rules to be obeyed. The writing of a book proposal, like any good writing, is far more of an art than a science. We will progress our way through the various headings in the template in turn, and along the way I will use the proposal I wrote for my forthcoming book, which is published next month, which is called Cultural Hermeneutics. And I'll use that to illustrate what I'm talking about. All these headings, by the way, are also to be included in the final proposal document, although I do drop the text down from the 16-point font size for the headings to 12-point for the written content. In overall terms, my cultural hermeneutics proposal ran to just under 7 pages and 2,300 words. You'll see that the first section is highlighted in its own text box and contains the working title of the book. Cannot stress how important titles are. Many potential readers will make a decision on whether to explore your book further or not to on the basis of the title alone. Here, of course, your potential reader is an editor in a publishing house that you're approaching. Titles should be short, punchy, and clearly communicate what the book is about. They need to catch the eye and interest and create a desire to pick it up and discover more. There are many ways to create such a connection: by creative use of language and wordplay, by implicit or explicit referencing, or by the intriguing juxtaposition of ideas. So, for example, my first book on narrative preaching carried the title Finding the Plot. This reverses the idiomatic phrase in English, losing the plot, which describes someone who is confused and doesn't know what to do. Or again, in a book on mission, I chose as the main title a famous phrase from the Swiss theologian Emil Brunner, as a fire by burning, a clear reference for missiologists, and yet an intriguing image and idea for those who didn't recognize it. A former colleague of mine who was working in advertising once told me that they worked to a rule of a 13-word maximum for an effective initial presentation of an idea. I've taken that on board with my writing, so for the usual combination of title and subtitle of an academic theological book, I use this 13-word principle as a guide. For my latest book, the original working title was Cultural Hermeneutics, Reading the World Around Us as Christians. To begin with, I didn't have as Christians as a part of it, but I ultimately felt that somewhere in the subtitle I needed to establish that this was not a secular book. However, I was not completely happy with it, and as I felt it was rather clunky. But you've noticed that this section is for a working title. This is a useful reminder that it can change as the project progresses, as the book takes shape, and as you interact with your editor and those you use to read your early drafts. In the case of Cultural Hermeneutics, my editor agreed with me and didn't particularly like the subtitle. And having agreed in principle to begin to explore publishing the book with me, we went through various alternatives as we bounced ideas back and forth for the subtitle over several weeks. These subtitles to replace Reading the World Around Us as Christians included Foundations in Public Theology and Civic Discipleship, or again, reading our context through the perspective of the Bible to explore issues in public theology, or again, Christian faith, contemporary society, and personal identity. One afternoon, I remember sitting down and brainstorming for several hours to try and get it right, and I ended up with 42 variations on the theme. And in fact, it was my editor who finally cracked it. And the book now carries the subtitle of The World Through the Lens of Theology. The question you must have in the forefront of your mind is, who am I writing for? How do I establish a connection with them? Then, in doing that, the title must accurately convey what you're writing about. Most of the next section is self-explanatory, as it just carries your name and contact details. However, it is worth just spending a few moments on the biographical note. This is not dissimilar to the biographical details that a published book may carry, and these will give you a good steer when writing your own. It should establish who you are, what you do, what your experience is, and why that makes you the ideal person to write or have written this book. It's interesting that, having just received the mock-up covers of Cultural Hermeneutics, I see that the publisher has used what I wrote in the proposal word for word, just leaving out a list of published books that I'd included to demonstrate my track record as a published author. Size-wise, you should be aiming at no more than 80 to 100 words. Now we get to the meat of the proposal, the title description. This is not merely a summary of the contents, rather it should be answering the question what the book is about, how the subject is tackled, and why it is important. In publishing and wider industry, this is often called an elevator pitch. That is, imagine you are in an elevator and have a minute to pitch your book to someone you've never met before. My title description for Cultural Hermeneutics went like this. How do Christians go about understanding their cultural context in 21st century Britain? What is the relationship between faith and the culture in which it's lived? In 3 parts, Cultural Hermeneutics explores the questions: what are the significant formative influences for people of faith in our culture, and how should they be understood? What place does faith play in the pressing issues that face the nation? How far is individual identity unique to our own personhood, or merely the fruit of owning or rejecting prevailing cultural influences? At one level, this is a book that explores the forces competing for the allegiance of hearts and minds in our society. However, in doing so, it draws on the insights of missiology, sociology, and cultural studies to develop and apply strategies that enable elements of culture, from a movie to a political movement, to be interrogated, understood, and biblically evaluated. Not with a view to developing a contemporary apologetic or a revised moral code for millennials, but rather to provide the groundwork for social and personal transformation and the kingdom activism of cultural evangelization. When we move to the contents section, this is your chance to demonstrate the substance of what you're proposing. I would suggest the best way to do this is to list your chapter titles and then include a descriptive paragraph on each, explaining what you're going to write about and how it ties into the overall project. In my cultural hermeneutics proposal, this took 4 of my 7 pages and ran to 1,700 words. Keep in mind that you're explaining your project to 2 very different readers. The first will be the editor, who will probably have some theological knowledge, but may know little or nothing about the area you're writing about. By contrast, a peer reviewer may well be an expert in the field. This is not an easy balance to strike, but you will need to bear it in mind. As an aside, it's worth saying a little bit about the peer review process for book proposals. It's not unusual for publishers to share the feedback they've received with you. This can be incredibly helpful and give you important things to think about as you begin to write. However, sometimes it can be quite the opposite, where a reviewer has felt the need to make a comment when they really don't know what they're talking about, or to give seemingly negative criticism to demonstrate their own credentials. Don't take everything that is fed back to you to heart. and be prepared to receive it and quietly ignore it if, on reflection in your judgment, it's not merited. The next section is entitled Level, and this is simply to enable the publisher to understand in academic terms where your public is pitched. Is it an introductory text for high school students and new undergraduates, or is it a more advanced work that is more suitable for postgraduate study? For cultural hermeneutics, I wrote, "This is an interdisciplinary introduction and exploration of the relationship of theology and culture that presupposes an engagement roughly corresponding to third-year undergraduates." This has no need to be any longer than a single sentence. The section entitled Market speaks for itself, but it is vitally important you give this some serious thought, as it is, after all, the audience you're writing for. Remember, too, for the publisher, this is the key question. Will this title sell enough copies to make it a viable proposition? Again, to illustrate, as I began to tease out who my audience was for cultural hermeneutics, I was pleasantly surprised with where I ended up. 1, students studying at undergraduate and postgraduate levels with a focus or interest in missiology, and particularly with enculturation and contextualization theory. 2, theological educators and those engaged in ministerial formation. 3, mission practitioners and educators. 4, church leaders. 5, individuals interested in understanding and relating issues of faith and theology to their contemporary cultural context. Potential competing titles is a fascinating section to engage with, in that you have the opportunity to demonstrate that you know your field, that no one has actually addressed what you intend to write about, and that those who come close don't do what you're going to do. For cultural hermeneutics, I wrote a paragraph naming some high-profile authors who had written about culture from a theological perspective, and indicated that it was mostly as a commentary on popular culture and film studies. I also named the 2 books closest to what I was proposing, along with 2 others that were primarily devotional rather than works of academic theology. This section does not need to be exhaustive and shouldn't be any longer than 2 or 3 reasonably concise paragraphs. However, make sure you utilize it to strategically support your case for publication, albeit you will need to do that with subtlety and tact. Remember, too, that your potential publisher will know the present marketplace well, and your peer reviewer should also be on top of who has written what in your subject area. Even if they're not up to speed, either can easily Google the subject or do an Amazon search. The next section of unique features gives you the chance to state your USP. It does not have to be long or involved. For cultural hermeneutics, I wrote, exploring the mutuality of the shaping formative relationship of faith and culture in the contemporary British context, how culture is read and interpreted, and how it reads and interprets us. Then the estimated word extent goes to how much you're going to write. Working with my present publisher, the SCM Press, 70,000 words is their preferred length. My previous book, Episcopae, the Theory and Practice of Translocal Ministry, significantly overran and came in at around 102,000 words, and therefore pushed the published price up by 40%. Speaking with my publisher earlier this year, he said that they would not want a title under 50,000 words and would prefer not to go over 70,000 words as a general rule. Estimated earliest manuscript delivery date enables a publisher to begin to think about where your book might fit into their publishing schedule. If they want to go forward with your project, it will get a slot in their projected timetable when the contract is signed. I was initially writing cultural hermeneutics for an Easter 2021 submission, having signed a contract in November 2019. In fact, I finally sent off my manuscript just under 2 years later than this. Of course, COVID-19 happened in the meantime, and the shape of what I was writing dramatically changed during the extended period of research I had during lockdown. However, having kept my editor up to date with my progress, he approved of the evolving shape of the project and was able to juggle their schedule for when my manuscript did finally emerge. The final section of potential commendations is also a useful one to think about. I've always used people I know or who I was in contact with, and of course the important thing is that they know something about your subject and have a name that can add to the salability of your book. Invariably, the endorsements are included on the various booksellers' websites and in promotional material, as well as on the book itself. For cultural hermeneutics, I'd been in correspondence with Professor Kevin Van Hooser of Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the States. Last week, I was really pleased to read the endorsement that he's written for my back cover. So there it is, the quite straightforward guide to writing a book proposal, or why it's important not to send your chosen publisher a full manuscript unless they ask you for one. On which subject, it's worth noting that it's not unusual for a publisher to ask for a couple of sample chapters with a proposal, or having read your proposal to ask to see something then. Finally, a sobering reality to consider and a pleasant discovery. The sobering reality is that no one gets rich publishing academic theology. In fact, the hourly rate of return on the time you will invest in reading, research, and thinking and writing does not bear thinking about. However, with a legitimate mainstream publisher, you will get paid. This will be itemized in your contract and will be expressed as a percentage of each book after an initial number of units have been sold. When I signed my first book contract almost 20 years ago now, this was 13%. Now, 5% seems to be more like the industry standard as margins have been severely squeezed. But across my various titles that are still in print or available as ebooks, this does run to the equivalent of several hundred euros a year. In addition, and being a bibliophile, this is the fun bit. I get an author discount of 35% on any book my publisher publishes. The downside is that it's still usually cheaper on Amazon. Thank you.